I thought I was just meeting an informant to expose a criminal network, but I walked right into a setup designed to bury me under a heavy legal charge. Now, trapped between a corrupt officer and a professional death squad, I've realized that the city's darkest secrets go much deeper than I ever imagined. The heat in the city was stifling, a thick, humid blanket that made the asphalt shimmer like a mirage. I had just stepped out of my unmarked vehicle, my suit jacket feeling like a suit of armor in the midday sun. I was heading to a local diner to meet an informant who promised information on an organized scheme infiltrating the city's dockyards. I didn't want any trouble. I just wanted to do my job, secure the intel, and go home to a quiet apartment. I had been undercover for 6 months, and my nerves were frayed at the edges. I walked down the sidewalk, minding my own business, when a cruiser screeched to a halt behind me, mounting the curb with a violent jolt. The sirens weren't blaring, which was the first sign that this wasn't an official call. It was personal. Before I could even turn around fully, the car door flew open, hitting the pavement with a metallic clang. Officer Miller. I recognized him immediately. He had a reputation in the precinct that traveled faster than the patrol cars. A man who lived for the power trip, a man who saw the world through a lens of deep-seated prejudice. "Hey, you! Freeze right there!" His voice boomed, sharp and dripping with an arrogance that made my skin crawl. I stopped, keeping my hands visible, my movements deliberate and calm. I had been trained for this, though not quite in this context. I turned slowly, my expression neutral. "Officer, is there a problem?" Miller stepped into my personal space, his hand resting conspicuously on his holster. He was a stocky man with a face that seemed perpetually flushed with aggression. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my tailored jacket and the expensive watch on my wrist, an inheritance from my father. "Problem? Yeah, there's a problem. You fit the description of a suspect involved in a massive illegal weapons trafficking ring. And given your demeanor, I'd say you're carrying too." I felt the familiar, cold calm of my training settle over me. "Officer, I am not involved in any illegal activity. You are mistaken. I'm a federal employee, and I'd suggest you take a breath before you make a mistake you can't walk back from." Miller let out a harsh, barking laugh, glancing back at his partner, who remained in the car, eyes averted, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. "Federal employee? You? That's rich. You look like the kind of guy who deals in illegal substances or runs with a local street gang. You think because you're wearing a fancy suit you can talk down to me?" "I'm not talking down to you," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm stating facts. I have my identification in my inner jacket pocket. I am going to reach for it now, very slowly." "Don't you dare move!" he roared, his face darkening. "If your hand moves an inch, I'll see it as a threat. You're under arrest for obstruction and possession of illegal equipment. Get on the ground, now!" I stood my ground, my heart hammering a rhythmic, steady beat against my ribs. I knew the game he was playing. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to lash out so he could justify his hostility. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. I remained upright, my jaw set. "Officer, you are conducting a stop without probable cause. I am a federal agent. If you proceed with this, you are opening yourself up to a major internal investigation." Miller's face twisted into a snarl. He grabbed his radio, his eyes never leaving mine. "Dispatch, I have a suspect in custody, resisting arrest. He's claiming he's federal, but he's clearly a high-level associate in an organized scheme. He's being hostile. I need backup. Now!" He moved in closer, the scent of stale coffee and aggression radiating off him. He shoved me back, trying to force me to lose my balance. My boots held firm. I realized then that this wasn't just a routine encounter. He was determined to bury me under a mountain of lies. He reached for his handcuffs, his grip bruising. "I'm going to make sure you never see the light of day," he whispered, his voice vibrating with pure hatred. "I'm going to plant enough evidence on you to ensure an attempt to break your life with a heavy legal charge. You're going away for a massive term, and no amount of fancy talk is going to save you." I felt the cold metal of the handcuffs tighten around my wrists, biting into my skin. He was going to frame me, and he was doing it right in the middle of a busy street. As he shoved me toward the hood of his cruiser, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag filled with a white substance. He grinned, a predator watching his prey collapse. "Look what I found in your pocket, pal," he sneered, holding it up for the passing pedestrians to see. "Looks like you're going down for a long, long time." I looked at the bag, then back at him, my expression hardening into one of grim resolution. I hadn't wanted to reveal my identity here, but I had no choice. I cleared my throat, my voice echoing across the quietening street. "You have no idea who you just targeted." He laughed again, pulling his radio up to call for transport, completely ignoring my warning. But then, my own phone began to buzz in my pocket, a specific encrypted ping from the Service of Internal Safety. My handler had been tracking my location for the meeting. He knew exactly where I was. As Miller reached to shove me into the back of the cruiser, a black SUV roared around the corner, screeching to a halt and boxing us in. 4 men in dark suits stepped out, their expressions unreadable, their badges catching the sunlight. Miller froze, his hand still on my shoulder, the plastic bag in his other hand suddenly feeling very heavy. The lead agent walked straight toward us, his gaze locking onto Miller's hand. The trap had been set, but for whom? The lead agent, a man named Sterling whose reputation for absolute cold-blooded efficiency was legendary in the Bureau, stepped between Miller and me. The air around the cruiser seemed to ionize. Miller's grip on my arm faltered, his bravado instantly replaced by a flicker of genuine primal confusion. He didn't know who these men were, but the way they held themselves, shoulders back, eyes scanning every rooftop and window, spoke of a tactical discipline that went far beyond local law enforcement. "Officer Miller," Sterling said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a sledgehammer. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. He simply held out a hand, palm open, signaling for Miller to back off. Miller sputtered, his face flushing a deeper, angrier red. "Who the hell are you? This is an ongoing investigation. This suspect is a threat. I found packets with forbidden substances on him. Stay out of this unless you want to be charged with obstruction." I watched Miller's partner, still sitting in the driver's seat, finally kill the engine. He was staring at the 4 men surrounding us, his face drained of all color. He clearly recognized the insignias on their tactical vests, even if Miller was too blinded by his own arrogance to see the storm brewing. Sterling didn't even blink at the threat. He turned to me, his gaze softening into something professional and respectful. "Special Agent, are you unharmed?" The silence that followed was deafening. The street seemed to go quiet, the hum of traffic fading into the background. Miller's eyes widened, his gaze darting from Sterling to me, then back to the plastic bag still clutched in his shaking hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow, the weight of his mistake beginning to settle into his bones. "Special Agent?" Miller choked out, his voice cracking. "He's a criminal. He was trying to sell this evidence." "That," Sterling said, pointing a steady finger at the bag in Miller's hand, "is a federal offense. Not because of what's inside, but because you just walked into a sting operation and attempted to frame a federal officer with planted, restricted evidence. Your department has been under the microscope for weeks, Miller. We've been watching you for months. We were waiting to see if you'd finally cross the line. Today, you did a marathon sprint over it." Miller backed away, his heels catching on the curb. He fumbled for his weapon, a reflex born of desperation and pure, unadulterated fear. "You're lying. This is a setup. You're all in on the organized scheme, protecting your own." "Drop the weapon, officer," the agent to my left said, his voice calm, steady, and terrifyingly final. He hadn't drawn his piece yet, but his hand was hovering just inches from his holster. "Don't do it, Miller," I said, my voice steady, rising from the crouch I was still held in. "It's over. You're being recorded. Your partner is already stepping out with his hands up. Look at him." Miller spun his head around. His partner, the man who had been sitting in the passenger seat, was indeed standing with his hands raised, backing away from the cruiser with a look of sheer terror. He was already distancing himself from the inevitable collapse. Miller's chest heaved. He looked at the street, at the pedestrians who were now pulling out their phones, at the black SUVs that had sealed off both ends of the block. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and the bars were closing in. He looked down at the plastic bag, then up at me, his eyes wide, manic. "I won't be the only one to go down," Miller shouted, his voice cracking into a shrill register. "I have people higher up. I have protection." "We know exactly who your contacts are, Miller," Sterling said, stepping closer. "That's why we're here. And that's why you're not going to be able to make a deal. You're not a pawn anymore. You're the lead evidence in a much larger investigation." Miller's face went pale. The reality of his situation, the decades of potential incarceration, the loss of his badge, his pension, his freedom, began to register. He dropped the bag. It hit the pavement with a dull, sickening thud. His hands hovered in the air, trembling violently. "You think you won?" Miller snarled, his gaze fixed on me. "You think because you have a badge, you're the hero? I know who you're really after. I know what's hidden in those docks. If you think I'm the one they're worried about, you're dead wrong. The people I work for? They don't leave witnesses. And they know you're here, standing in the open." A sharp, high-pitched whistle cut through the air, a sound I knew all too well. It was the sound of a long-range tactical signal. My skin pricked with warning. Before Sterling could react, I tackled him, throwing us both behind the heavy engine block of the cruiser. "Get down!" I screamed. A split second later, a bullet tore through the air where our heads had been a moment before, shattering the windshield of the cruiser into 1,000 crystalline diamonds. Then, a second shot echoed, tearing into the hood of the car. We were pinned, under fire, and the real enemy had just arrived. The glass shattered in a symphony of destruction, showering us in jagged, glittering debris. I pressed my back against the vibrating frame of the cruiser, my lungs burning as I inhaled the scent of burnt rubber and pulverized safety glass. Sterling was already moving, his tactical instincts overriding the shock of the ambush. He pulled his radio from his belt with a single fluid motion, his voice low and sharp. "Code Black. We're taking fire on 4th and Main. Multiple shooters, high caliber, elevated position." "They're pinning us down from the warehouse roof," I shouted over the sudden, chaotic roar of the street. Pedestrians were screaming, diving for cover, and the once busy intersection had transformed into a war zone. Miller was still in the middle of it all, his face drained of color as he scrambled to get behind his own car door, the reality of his protection finally dawning on him. These people weren't here to save him. They were here to silence anyone who could link them to the organized scheme. I gripped my service piece, a standard-issue compact pistol, and peered over the hood. The street was a labyrinth of parked cars and panicked civilians. Above, the silhouettes of two individuals clad in matte black gear were perched on the fire escape of the adjacent warehouse. They weren't just random thugs, they were professional contractors. The precision of their shots, the way they moved in tandem, this was a tactical hit. "We can't stay here," Sterling yelled, pulling a secondary sidearm and checking the chamber. "The cruiser won't hold against sustained fire. We need to move to the alleyway on the left, on my count." "Wait!" I grabbed his arm. "Look at Miller." Miller had completely broken. He was huddled on the ground near the front wheel, sobbing, his hands clamped over his head. The professional shooters weren't targeting us anymore. They had turned their sights on him. A bullet ricocheted off the asphalt inches from his boot, sending sparks dancing into the air. They were cleaning house, and they were starting with their own liability. "He knows something," I realized aloud. "If they take him out, we lose the only lead we have on the higher-ups." "He's a liability, and he's an enemy officer," Sterling countered, though his eyes were already calculating the odds. "But he's a witness. If he dies, the investigation goes dark." "I'm going for him," I said. It was reckless. It went against every protocol of my training, but if I let a corrupt officer be executed by a professional death squad while I watched, I wasn't just losing a lead. I was losing my soul. "Don't be a fool," Sterling shouted, but I was already moving. I vaulted over the hood of the cruiser, the movement feeling like it took an eternity. A bullet whistled past my ear, the displacement of air vibrating against my skin. I slid across the pavement, coming to a stop at Miller's side. He looked up, his eyes unfocused and terrified. "Help me," he whispered, the arrogance gone, replaced by the hollow shell of a man realizing he was mere seconds from death. I didn't answer him. I grabbed his collar, hauling him toward the heavy concrete pillar of the nearby storefront. Just as we reached the shelter, a heavy volley of fire hammered the sidewalk behind us, the impact carving craters into the concrete. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that made everything feel as if it were moving in slow motion. "Why?" Miller gasped, cowering behind the pillar. "Why save me? I tried to frame you." "Because I'm not like you," I spat, my voice tight. "And because I need you to tell me who sent them." "They're not from the city," Miller stuttered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "They're part of a deep cover unit. They told me if I got caught, they'd handle the cleanup. They're not just trying to kill me, they're trying to bury the whole precinct." Suddenly, a massive black van, unmarked and reinforced, swerved onto the sidewalk, tires screeching as it cut off our escape route. The back doors flew open before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. 3 figures emerged, masked, carrying high-powered hardware that made my standard-issue pistol feel like a child's toy. They didn't shout. They didn't issue commands. They just began to advance, firing a relentless rhythmic sequence that forced Sterling to stay hunkered behind the cruiser. I looked at the alleyway, then at the van, then back at the rooftop. We were boxed in. The shooters on the roof had repositioned, and the team on the ground was closing the gap. I reached for my comms, trying to signal backup, but all I got was static, the shrill electronic screech of a jammer. "They've got a jammer running," I said, my heart sinking. "We're on our own." Sterling peeked out, fired 2 shots, and pulled back instantly as a hail of lead tore through the passenger door of the cruiser. "They're not here to talk. They're going to level this block to get to us." As the lead shooter raised a long-barreled weapon, aiming it directly at the pillar where Miller and I were huddled, I saw the glint of a laser sight move across the pavement toward my chest. It stopped, locking onto my heart. I knew the distance. I knew the caliber. I knew there was no way to dodge the next pull of that trigger. I looked at Miller, who had squeezed his eyes shut, and then at Sterling, who was bracing for the final rush. Then, the sound of the engine changed. A low, guttural rumble began to vibrate through the ground, vibrating up through my boots. It wasn't the van. It was something heavier. A massive armored transport, a tactical vehicle marked with the seal of the state, crashed through the barricade at the end of the street, ramming the van with such force that it sent the vehicle spinning across the intersection like a toy. The dust and debris filled the air, turning the world into a gray, suffocating fog. I stayed low, waiting for the smoke to clear, watching as the side door of the heavy transport opened. I expected backup. I expected my team. But what stepped out wasn't wearing a standard uniform. They were wearing tactical gear that carried no identification, their faces obscured by full face masks. The leader stepped forward, raised a weapon, and instead of engaging the shooters, he aimed his rifle directly at me. "Agent," the voice was synthetic, distorted by a modulator. "Step away from the target, or you become part of the collateral." The air was thick with pulverized concrete and the metallic tang of spent casings. The armored vehicle, a beast of blackened steel, idled like a hungry predator, its engine thrumming at a frequency that rattled my teeth. The masked figure pointing the rifle at me held his stance with a terrifying, absolute rigidity. Behind him, 2 others moved with the synchronized grace of a hunting pack, their weapons sweeping the area. They weren't police, and they weren't the shooters who had pinned us down. They were something far more precise, far more dangerous. "Drop your sidearm," the leader ordered, his voice filtered through a digital screech. This is a sanctioned extraction. You are outside your jurisdiction." "Sanctioned by who?" I shouted back, holding my position behind the pillar. My grip on my weapon was white-knuckled, my pulse drumming a frantic rhythm in my ears. I could see Sterling out of the corner of my eye. He was watching them, his gun lowered just an inch, his brow furrowed in a confusion that I mirrored. These people were an unknown variable in a game that was already spiraling out of control. "That is none of your concern," the leader replied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. The laser dot on my chest held firm, unblinking. "Move, and we complete the objective. Stay, and we add you to the file." Miller was hyperventilating at my feet, his fingernails clawing into the asphalt. "Don't let them take me!" he shrieked, the sound tearing through the chaotic silence of the street. "They're going to execute me the moment I'm in that van. They're the ones who bankroll the organized scheme. They're the ones who bought the badge." The leader's head snapped toward Miller. "The subject is compromised. Proceed with immediate neutralization." The command was so cold, so devoid of human emotion, that it felt like ice water hitting my spine. The masked figure adjusted his aim, shifting the laser from my chest to Miller's head. "Not today," I growled. I didn't think, I acted. I lunged to the side, throwing my body weight against Miller and dragging him behind the corner of the brick building, just as the muzzle flash from the leader's rifle illuminated the gray fog. The bullet sparked against the brick where Miller's head had been a heartbeat earlier. "Sterling, move!" I screamed. Sterling surged from behind the cruiser, firing a suppressive burst that forced the masked team to scatter. It was a chaotic scramble of limbs and tactical movement. I hauled Miller toward the alleyway, my boots sliding on the debris-strewn ground. We sprinted into the shadows, the darkness of the narrow passage offering our only respite from the heavy weaponry being unleashed in the street. We tore through the alley, the sounds of shouting and gunfire echoing behind us like a fading nightmare. I checked my corners, my training screaming at me to secure the perimeter, but my priority was Miller. He was a coward, he was a bigot, and he was a criminal. But he was currently the only person alive who could pull the thread that would unravel the entire conspiracy. "Keep moving," I panted, slamming him against a wall as we reached the far end of the alley. I checked my weapon, 2 rounds left. I checked my radio, still nothing but the rhythmic electronic hum of the jammer. We were effectively ghosts. "Why are you doing this?" Miller gasped, his face smeared with dirt and his own tears. "I'm a corrupt cop. I'm the guy you should be putting in a cell. Why are you risking your life for me?" "Because if I don't, the people who ordered that hit win," I said, catching my breath. "I don't care about your soul, Miller. I care about the fact that your death would make their work easier. Now start talking. Who is behind the armored transport? Who is the bank?" Miller stared at me, his lip quivering. He looked toward the end of the alley, toward the street where the battle was still raging, then back at me. He seemed to shrink, as if the weight of his own secret was crushing his ribs. "They call him the architect. He doesn't have a name. He doesn't have a face. He's been moving the forbidden substances through the city for years, and he's got people in the internal inspection department on his payroll. That's why I was so cocky. I thought I was untouchable because he was backing me." "The architect," I repeated, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. "Where is he? Where can we find him?" Miller hesitated, his eyes darting to the shadows at the end of the alley. "He's at the port. Warehouse 14. He's overseeing a shipment tonight. A massive influx of those packets. He's going to move it all by dawn." Before I could ask for more, a shadow stretched across the pavement in front of us. A pair of heavy combat boots clicked against the concrete. I pivoted, weapon raised, only to find myself staring down the barrel of a suppressor-equipped rifle. It wasn't the masked team from the street. It was someone else. Standing at the entrance of the alley was a woman in a sharp gray business suit, her hair pulled back into a severe bun. She held her weapon with the casual, terrifying ease of an expert. She wasn't wearing a mask. She didn't need to. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "I believe you've talked quite enough." She looked at me, a faint, condescending smile playing on her lips. "And as for you, Special Agent, you really shouldn't have interfered. You were doing so well at being a wallflower." She squeezed the trigger, but there was no sound of a gunshot. Instead, a tiny, glowing projectile whistled through the air and struck my shoulder with a sharp, burning sting. I felt my arm go dead instantly, my weapon clattering to the ground. My vision blurred at the edges, the world swaying like a ship on a turbulent sea. "Bring them both," she ordered, and 2 more figures stepped from the shadows, their movements silent, their presence inevitable. As I fell to my knees, struggling to keep my eyes open, I realized the trap hadn't just been in the street. The entire city had been a cage, and I had just walked into the center of the web. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the woman stepping closer, her gaze cold and empty. "You think you're here to save the city, Agent? You're just the final ingredient in the architect's masterpiece." The darkness didn't last as long as they intended. It was a chemical cocktail, a sedative designed to keep you under, but my body had been hardened by years of fieldwork and adrenaline. I blinked, the sharp scent of ozone and stale sea air biting at my nostrils. I was zip-tied to a chair in the middle of a cavernous space. The rhythm of the tide against the pier told me exactly where I was. Warehouse 14. Across from me, Miller was slumped over, still unconscious, his head lolling against his chest. I felt my wrists. The restraints were industrial grade, but the sharp corner of a steel support beam was inches from my right hand. I didn't waste time on regret. I shifted, grinding the plastic ties against the rusted iron, feeling the biting sensation as the sharp edge began to shave away the binding. Footsteps echoed, heavy, measured. The woman in the gray suit stepped into the circle of light cast by a hanging industrial bulb. She checked her watch, a movement so mundane it felt like a slap in the face. "You're resilient, Agent. That's a quality I admire," she said, her voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. "It's a shame, really. You had a decorated career. You could have been a hero, if you'd just learned to look the other way." "The architect," I rasped, my throat feeling like it was lined with glass. "You're just his courier." She laughed, a short, dry sound. "We are all couriers. The architect doesn't deal in individuals, he deals in systems, and tonight, this system is being flushed." As she turned to walk toward a massive stack of crates, I managed to snap the final fiber of the restraint. My hands were free, but I kept them behind my back, feigning helplessness. I looked at Miller. He was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around, panicked, until his eyes locked onto mine. I gave him a subtle, sharp nod toward the side exit. He got the message. "Miller," the woman called out without turning around. "You're awake. Good. You have one final duty before your termination. You're going to open the manifest for this shipment. It's your final act of service to the organization." Miller stood, his legs trembling. He looked at me, then at the crates. For a moment, the old, arrogant light flickered in his eyes, but then he looked at the woman's weapon, a sleek, suppressed pistol tucked into her waistband, and his resolve shattered. He walked toward the crates, his movements stiff. "Now," I whispered, barely audible. Miller grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from a nearby table. He didn't go for the crates. He swung with everything he had at the electrical panel on the wall. The impact was deafening, a shower of sparks raining down as the main breaker exploded in a burst of blinding white light. The warehouse plunged into total pitch-black silence. "Get down!" I roared, lunging forward. I tackled the woman before she could find her footing. We hit the concrete hard, my deadened shoulders screaming in protest. I disarmed her in one fluid motion, the cold steel of the pistol finding my palm. The darkness became a symphony of chaos. I fired 2 warning shots into the rafters, the sound rolling through the warehouse like thunder, and the men patrolling the aisles panicked, opening fire in every direction. "Miller, get to the perimeter!" I yelled. He didn't argue. He bolted for the exit. I wasn't just here to survive. I was here to finish this. I utilized the flashes of gunfire to navigate, moving through the shadows, taking out the guards one by one with calculated, surgical precision. I moved with the ghosts of my training, every shot hitting its mark. When I finally cornered the woman near the main loading dock, the external lights of a massive police task force, led by Sterling, began to strobe against the warehouse windows. The internal check that had been tracking us had finally arrived, led by the very people who had been waiting for the signal to strike. "It's over," I said, pointing the weapon at her. "The shipment is exposed. Your organized scheme is done." She looked at the lights, her expression not of fear, but of profound, unsettling resignation. "You think you've ended it, Agent? You've only removed a branch." The tree is still rooted. As the tactical team breached the doors, flooding the warehouse with light and shouting commands, she dropped her hands. She didn't fight. She was processed, hauled away by men who looked just as cold and detached as she had been. The aftermath was a whirlwind of paperwork and internal debriefings. Miller, despite his crimes, provided the state with the names, the bank accounts, and the meeting locations of the entire network. He would spend his life behind bars, but he had traded his silence for a sliver of redemption. I sat in my car outside the precinct a week later, the city finally quiet. Sterling walked over and leaned against my door. "You did good, kid. The internal investigation is wrapping up. We've dismantled the entire operation from the inside out." "And the architect?" I asked, looking out at the skyline. Sterling stared at the horizon, his expression unreadable. "The architect is a ghost, Agent, and ghosts don't leave footprints. But for the first time in a decade, the city feels like it can breathe." I nodded, starting the engine. I had lost a piece of my peace of mind, but the nightmare was over. I wasn't a hero in the way the books described. I was just a man who had done his job when the world tried to force him to be something else. As I drove away, I knew one thing for certain. I would keep my eyes open. Because in a city built on secrets, someone is always watching. And I was finally ready to watch back.